Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to welcome Ivan Krastev, an old friend, to this Delphi Economic Forum. I'm sure you know that Ivan is a leading public intellectual with a strong imprint on the European and global public debate. He's regular columnist with the Financial Times. He's a key figure with the European Council of Foreign Relations. He's the chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia. He's Bulgarian. And he's a permanent fellow with the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna. So he's in many places. So, Ivan, glad to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Our subject this afternoon is further European Union enlargement and the new geopolitical landscape. I mean, you might describe EU history as a history of never-ending enlargements. There's been many of them. And the fact that more and more countries want to join the European Union is perhaps the surest sign of success. If more and more countries want to join your club, there must be something in it, unless all of them are masochists. So, but with the latest enlargement, it's been on the table for many years, but very little has been happening. I mean, the countries of the Western Balkans, plus Turkey, have been candidates for many years. And if I were to summarize in a cynical fashion what has been happening in all these years, the European Union has been pretending to negotiate for accession, and the candidates were pretending to reform. And nothing happened. And now suddenly we have Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We have a totally new geopolitical landscape. War is back. And enlargement is again at the top of the European political agenda. Now, Ivan, is it really true? Has the geopolitical agenda, the shifting geopolitical agenda, changed dramatically the prospects for further enlargement? And why?
Yeah. I do believe it's true. And also I do believe that the change is very big, and because we're using the words that we have been using before, from time to time, this is not allowing us to see the change. If they're going to be next enlargement, it will be so different than the previous ones. And from this point of view, compare 2003, after basically the wars for the dissolution of Yugoslavia, there was this talk, Thessaloniki process and so on. But there was a certain assumption back then, and the assumption was that the East is going to change and the West is going to remain the same. And in my view, we're entering in a totally different conversation. This is not about simply the enlargement of the EU, it's about major change of the European Union itself. And what has changed is first the nature of the borders. Before, European Union was the only great power that didn't know where its borders are. We have been very famous for soft borders. In a certain way, European Union was convinced that we are bordering future members. This is not the case anymore. Basically, the border between Russia and European Union is going to be a totally different type of borders. So European Union is much more trying to secure a certain type of a geopolitical space, not so much even because all the countries in this part of the world are so much pushing for this. By the way, support for the EU enlargement in some of the countries of the Western Balkans, which are quite tired of these long negotiations, is much lower than it was in other places before. This time, European Union is also very much interested to find a way to stabilize and consolidate. And from my point of view, this is a different, and my last point on this is I was yesterday, don't ask me why, reminded of an old movie, which probably some of the young people even don't know that it exists, but it's called Being There. And this is an old comedy from the 1980s, and in this comedy, the major character is somebody that has been not leaving his house, and he has been watching television all his life, so when he was attacked on the street, he simply tried to change the channel. And I have the feeling that in a certain moment, particularly after February 2022, this is what we did. We have been so much in a world of our own that we tried to change the channel. And when Chancellor Merkel, after 2014, said that after talking to President Putin, that we are living in a different world, we had to realize that now we are living in his world and not that he's living in ours.
Okay, the EU, the enlarged EU, suppose that it happens, is going to be a very different EU. Is it going to be essentially an anti-Russia EU?
It is going to be anti-Russia in a certain way, but I do believe it goes much deeper. And it goes to the way that the major assumption on which European security was based have been questioned dramatically. European Union was a peace project, and it was very much a peace project between its members. It should be, and now it's much more redefined as a peace and war project. And from this point of view, it's not only about Russia.
And Europeans find it very difficult to adjust to that.
No, but listen, this is for me, the biggest difficulty comes from the fact that we're talking not simply about economic change or policy change, we're talking about a cultural change. European Union is a victim of its success and not of its failure. And the biggest example of this is Germany. The biggest success of Germany was pacification of German mind. The biggest success of Germany was that the German military, when they go to work, they prefer to go in civilian clothes and basically change in uniforms when they're in their unit. Now this major cultural achievement is perceived as vulnerability. And I do believe that this is really what makes the problem for Europe slightly different than for everybody else. How to deal with a crisis, which is the crisis very much rooted in certain type of successes that you have, is incredible. And I'm just going to give you 5 assumptions that have been, in my view, challenged in a big way. The first is, we believe that war is not possible. And by the way, when people said why the Europeans didn't trust the American intelligence that they're going to be a major war, one is that, of course, in Afghanistan, there was a good reasons not to trust back then what American intelligence said. But the major story is we do not believe that a major war is possible. We believe that military conflicts are possible here and there, but not a major war. Secondly, Europeans, we managed to convince ourselves that hard power doesn't matter. You remember in the doctrine in 2003, the idea was, okay, America had so much hard power, so what? Yeah. And now you understand that it doesn't matter when you don't have it. I'm always giving one figure. When the war started in Ukraine, Ukraine has ammunition for 6 weeks. Germany for 3 days. In a certain way, this is such a cultural change, plus the role of nationalism.
If I may intercede, I mean, Brussels' dreams were made of a world in which there are strong multilateral institutions with rules, growing economic interdependence, from which the Europeans with open economies benefit, and they exercise their soft power, while relying on the Americans if things go for the worst.
Totally,
but this world is no longer.
And this is true. In my view, what is in my view very important is that there is an identity change on Europe, which we don't know how to talk about. Because before the World War I, because of European empires, European order was the world. And then comes the Cold War, and of course neither the United States nor Soviet Union have been a classical European powers, but at the same time, Europe was at the center of the geopolitical confrontation. Everything was about Berlin. And now, after the end of the Cold War, in my view, Europe reinvented itself as the laboratory for the future. We were convinced that our model of postmodern state, of a kind of a very much economy and soft power-centered politics, is what is coming. And in a certain way, we have been looking to the others and said, they're coming closer to us, they're coming closer to us. And then suddenly, you're woken up and trying to understand first that it's not true, but secondly, you don't understand others. And I'm even not touching on Russia on this. You're trying to see that this type of, for example, investment in strong military, almost everywhere. We're talking about multilateralism, but sovereignism is the one thing that is keeping very much everybody else engaged. And on the level of nationalism, it was interesting to see that part of the fascination with Ukraine and the success of Ukraine to respond to the Russian aggression was also realizing the mobilizing power of civic nationalism. It's not about kind of a simply abstract talk about democracy. They were defending their land. And this is a huge story because in my view, in the European social contract, death was not part of the contract. And this was very clear during the COVID. We made almost, for good reasons, death looking unnatural. And look at the, I do believe you're going to find the paradox of this. During COVID, you're putting most in order to save the most senior people in the society, the oldest, the most vulnerable. In the case of Ukraine, they're trying not to mobilize the youngest. And I do believe the demographic aspects of all this is also slightly neglected in all debate. And this is true for Russia, by the way. I do believe that there was a lot of demographic reasons why the war started. This is true for Ukraine, and I'm seeing here senior representatives of the Ukrainian leadership. It's clearly, for example, according to the demographic projections of the Demographic Institute of Ukraine, in year 2050, the population of Ukraine is going to be around 25 million people. Can you imagine about what kind of a change we're talking about?
Mm-hmm. So Ukraine is an extreme case of Europe. In that respect, in terms of demographics.
Nobody is going to understand also one of the reasons for the Russian aggression and war if it's not going to see to what extent the President Putin was preoccupied with the demographic decline in Russia. 3 months before the war, without being asked, in 3 different occasions, he was repeating one and the same phrase, that according to the famous Russian scientist from the 19th century, Dmitry Mendeleev, in the year 2000, there are going to be 500 million Russians in the world. And now there are only 130 million. So in a certain way, you do not have enough Russians. And this is why Belarusians should be Russians, Ukrainians should be Russians. This kind of a story is critically important. And I do believe that one of the things that Europeans, we are not great at, probably I do believe we're not bad thinking in terms of social trends. Of course, we're very much interested in technology, but try to understand this kind of fears of a shrinking society, aging, losing populations, and what can be the political implications of this is something that we don't know how to talk about because also we are afraid slightly of this conversation.
Okay. Let's go back to enlargement. I mean, the soon outgoing president of the European Council has said that by 2030, we should be ready, and we will be ready for further enlargement. Do you believe it? And if you do believe it, under what conditions?
So let's take the most, of course, important and difficult case, and this is Ukraine. And the story is the following. We don't know when the war is going to end up. We don't know how it is going to end up. But there is no position, particularly if basically Ukraine is going to lose certain territories, which you cannot basically exclude at all. The only way to stabilize this place is by integration. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you're going to produce a big black hole in the middle of Europe, which is security, which is economics. And to be honest, the place is going to be depopulated. From where I'm coming, I know that 60% of the population of Bosnia lives outside of the country. Listen, this cannot go like this. If you're not going to, and by the way, you cannot sell any type of a loss of territories if you're not going to give integration. But then comes the problem, what kind of integration, how it is going to look like. Mm-hmm. Because funnily enough, Ukraine now got certain things that normally you're getting at the end of the integration process. Free movement of people, agricultural exports. This is the most difficult start, and you're giving them from the beginning. How this is going to work. And also the countries which in security terms are most interesting of integrating Ukraine. I mean, countries like Poland, in economic terms, are going to be the biggest losers of all this. And I do believe as a result of it, I do believe the European Union is going to change much more than we are ready to admit. I'm not, you know, that, Loukas, you are the person who knows the European Union. And I don't know exactly how this is going to happen. I don't believe that this is going to be based on the type of the institutional things that we're talking about now.
But there are 2 things that are being talked more and more. One is integration by stages. Yeah. So you negotiate with the candidate country. As long as they fulfill some of the criteria, you integrate them in that particular policy sector, and you cough up the money, because that's crucial. Yeah. And the other is more and more differentiation. So a European Union of variable geometry, concentric circles, or whatever. Yeah. Whatever the term you want to use, but there is increasing consensus along those 2 things. Now, is this realistic? So a European Union of 35 with countries integrating by stages, countries being part of bit of the core, internal market and democratic functioning of democracy and rule of law, and then the rest, they are doing it in pieces. You have concentric circles, some are members of the internal market, others are members of the Eurozone, others are members of Schengen, others are members of foreign policy. Is that a manageable thing?
No, I don't know is it manageable or not. When I said that I don't know how it's going to work, I simply don't know. Okay. The other thing that you cannot simply do is, before you can keep the status quo, and the status quo was not destructive for the EU. It was not great for the people around, but the European Union can stay with this. And the metaphor that I'm always using is, before you have a waiting room, you're putting country in the waiting room, you're telling them that they're going to become member of the European Union at some point, and you believe that in the waiting room they can do things, but you can live there. It's not the most comfortable place, but you're going to get certain type of a food and certain things are going to happen and so on. This cannot happen because—
You can also try to make the waiting room more comfortable.
Yeah, but the problem is that the waiting room suddenly is becoming an emergency room.
Yeah.
And then you cannot ask people to stay in the emergency room for a long time. And then you're going to respond to certain things. And by the way, the crisis can go on a different level. The one which is very much obvious now is the war in Ukraine. And this is also a time pressure. By the way, if you want to do any type of a settlement which is not simply freezing, there should be something for Ukraine, yeah? So from this point of view, you cannot have any type of a peace strategy which is just telling Ukraine you're not going to do this and that. And in a defense terms, for example, even now you try to make Ukraine part of the European defense sector. You have at the moment in Ukraine the European country with the biggest army outside of Russia. So from this point of view, in my view, we're asking an old questions. And when you're asking an old questions, the answer doesn't matter.
Okay. Now, suppose we put ourselves in the shoes of, let's say, somebody living in Skopje, or somebody living in Montenegro. Is it fair to say that there are chances of even integrating by stages in the European Union depend essentially on how the war in Ukraine develops?
It does. At the same time, because Ukraine is particularly important for some of the countries on the east and some countries like Germany. But imagine that there are going to be also pressure from the south. And you're going to have immigration pressure. And also what is bad for these countries, which are in this waiting room, is that two things are happening. One is the exodus of people, and particularly of young professionals, is not reversed. As one Bulgarian voter told me 5 years ago, she said, every European Union is great, but they took our kids and our doctors. Yes. But the second thing is that from political level, because you cannot give them than you want, you have this story in which you end up with political regimes which are delivering you on certain level also selectively, but the process of internal democratization is not there, constituencies is not there, and also you have a rise of a certain anti-European and anti-Western sentiments on the, in these societies. Basically, they does not look like Poland or Czech Republic have been looking in 2004. So you cannot also ignore this process. Yeah. If you're asking me, do I believe that in the year 2030, Montenegro or Northern Macedonia are going to have a veto in the way the countries? I don't believe it. But to be honest, I'm not sure that basically even every single country is going to have the veto or the meaningful veto in the way you have today.
One of the paradoxes we have in the Western Balkans, which you very rightly pointed out, is that aspiration of EU membership means mostly the right to emigrate and leave your country, which is a paradox, right? And if the right to emigrate applies mostly to the most mobile and the brightest, the countries that are left behind have a serious problem, as they do.
Plus it has electoral consequences that people rarely talked about. Because, first of all, the younger population is a very small cohort for the demographic reasons, but also for the fact that the younger people, if you even think in terms of migration, even if you're not going to migrate actually, but if you're all the time asking yourself to stay or to leave, your view on the political process is totally different. You can decide not to vote. You can tolerate political things that you don't like. And because you don't have the numbers, you start basically to distrust particularly the elections to the extent that it's much easier to see younger people on the street protesting than basically voting. But then this is changing the very logic of the democratic process because you have a political electoral body which is strongly dominated by, first of all the people who are even not on the labor market. In 15 years, 25% of the Bulgarian population is going to be on retirement age. So then imagine what is the kind of a policy horizon of a government, and this is the most actively voting part of the population. And I do believe this kind of a changes how all this is changing the nature of the democratic process, the vote, the incentives for the politicians. For example, in a moment of a geopolitical crisis, what really starts to matter even to Brussels is what you're doing on 3 or 4 issues. For example, what you're doing with respect to the war in Ukraine. So if you're basically delivering on this, you can basically selectively decide not to do other things, which probably for you are much more costly politically, or this and that. And I do believe this type of a selective commitment to the European Union is something that you start to see in many places. And I hope I'm wrong on something, and I want to be very fair on this. I do believe that all of us are very much shaped by a certain type of experiences and generational experience that you have and the place where you have been born. But I'm coming from a generation that was 25-year-old in 1989. And in my view, the major difference between the East and West on the base of it is that we know how fast things can change. Not the direction, but how fast it can happen. How basically everything overnight can change. And my fear is that on the Western side, the experience is of much more stability. In a certain way, the change is much more prepared. You're discussing, doing this, doing that. And I have the feeling that we're in a time which much more reminds me of the late 1980s on the level of the speed of change, of the level of the surprises that you get, as a result of it on the level of the confusion that you have.
Okay.
And yeah.
I mean, change translates to a large extent in money. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, the big question today is that enlargement, if we are serious about it, will cost us money, and large sums of money. Growing defense needs translate into money. Aging population translates into money. Climate change translates into money. Technology lagging in Europe translates into investment and money. So the state is back. We need to raise more money to finance our ambitions, yet virtually every politician that I know of in Europe is promising lowering taxes to the electorate. So how does this square?
Okay. On our panel, I do believe that you are on the money side, and you know much more. But I'm going to say something that I saw based on some of the opinion polling that I have been seeing on European level. There is also an interesting problem with money. And this was very much seen with climate. This was much seen with migration. They're going to be now with defense. Governments go to people and said, listen, we are decisive. We are going to move trillions. And people get slightly scared because they're saying, till yesterday, you're telling us that there is no money. Now you're telling us that money is not the problem. This was after COVID. This was after the war. And this creates this kind of a mistrust, what is really going on. For me, the biggest problem, talking about from the point of view of the democratic process, is the following. Democracy is a future-oriented regime. In order for democracy to function, people should have the idea of an open future, which means that things are going to change. We can influence how things are changing. Something can be changed today, but it cannot, if not today, we can change it tomorrow. So now you have two extinction rebellions that are clashing in the center of European politics. On the left, you have the climate people who said, if something is not going to be decided now, it doesn't matter what's going to be decided in 3 or 4 days. It's going to be too late. And then the same with the great replacement right, who said, if you're not going to reverse process now, our way of life is going to be destroyed tomorrow. This is what really worries me most, because I do believe that the moment future is perceived as closed, if governments believe that they cannot make mistakes, it's very difficult for democracy to operate. The system is based on the fact that you can make mistakes, and after that...
But even there is another contradiction, and this is that we are faced with long-term challenges and with the need to think strategically in democracies which are becoming increasingly hostage of the ephemeral. How do you reconcile the two?
No, listen, I do believe that we are here to discuss, not to answer, because if we know the answers, it's going to be easier. My feeling is that there is a deeper cultural change that we, for different reasons, are not ready to talk about. And I'm going to give you 2 or 3 things that really scared me. Do you know what is the birth rates and reproduction in a society like Finland? Give me a society which is extremely wealthy, very egalitarian, very kind of a general social policies. They have less than one child per woman. Not easy to explain. Listen, this is not this type of families which there are other parts of the world where you have, for example, a rich society. How it happened, what it follows. To what extent the fact that we're living longer is also not changing the way we're seeing many things, starting from family, but also how many lives we should live. And in my view, we're in this kind of a cultural transition which we try to all the time to translate on the policy language, and it's not easy. And I'm going to give one example. The German government is extremely unpopular these days. If there are Germans in the room, they're going to agree with this. But if you're going to see what is interesting is the mandate. On climate, they have a mandate to change the world, but they don't have a mandate to change anything of your way of life. You can change everything, but don't tell me how to live. Don't tell me what car to go, and so on and so on. And in my view, this is what we are seeing now. And as a result of it, no policy, no transfer of money are going to be enough, because the force is to basically reperceive the world. And by the way, this is going to go in other countries. In some of the other countries, what is the war? For President Putin, war is an identity-building machine. You're creating, I'm always giving one figure which probably people are not aware of. In 2018, 73% of the Russian population believed that in the next 10 years they're going to be World War III. So this kind of apocalyptic mind that is coming, and which is changing the way you're seeing the threats, the risks, the opportunities, and the only important positivism is coming from the technological world. This is also creating a major generational divide. As a result of it, if I go metaphorically, the younger generation, they slightly start to behave like the last generation. So they're slightly like in a judgment day. They treat all previous generations, even the dead, as their contemporaries. For example, they're judging their choices and what they have been doing and so on as if they're living now. And in my view, this change of the experience of time, the speed and direction, this is for me the biggest challenge that we have.
We've got a bit less than 3 minutes, so I'll ask you an unfair question to finish with. What do you think is the most likely scenario for the war in Ukraine to end? And if so, and when you tell us what the scenario is, how should Europe handle the outcome? I know it's unfair.
No, listen, this is unfair, but also it's kind of unimportant, because what I think doesn't matter much, to be honest. But I always believe that it's going to be either Korean or West German scenario without knowing exactly where the front line is going to be. I do believe that if Ukraine is not going to be integrated, being NATO, being European Union, this type of a settlement is going to be totally unstable, totally unstable. When it's going to happen and how it's going to happen, I don't know. Of course, it's very much up to Ukraine. But to be honest, European Union is fighting much more and struggling to get an Oscar for a supporting role. And this is part of the story. And the biggest story is what is going to happen if the United States decided and redefined this simply as a European problem and leaving European Union and Ukraine on their own. So from this point of view, and I am saying this in front of the Ukrainian colleagues, is when the war started, we basically realized how much we don't know about Russian society. I'm not sure that we know also how the Ukrainian society is changing much. And this kind of a trying to imagine things and so on is something that I found critically important.
So your answer is ceasefire a la Korean with
But
what?
Don't forget, in South Korea, there is tens of thousands of Western troops.
Yeah. But then you're proposing integration of Ukraine or what is left.
This is, but this is.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ivan.
Yeah, thank you.
It was great.